Hey everybody, I'm Corey Harrison. I'm here with Dan and Jeremy.
Hey.
And we're going to have a great conversation today about an article titled 5 Hard Truths About Healthy Church Growth. Now, before you think to yourself, I'm not a church leader, not a minister, I'm not an elder, so church growth really isn't something that's relevant to me. I think what you're going to find is this article has a lot of really great insights for just your average, everyday church member. Because ultimately, I think church growth, let me just share this quote from the article because it's wonderful. The author says, when you see baptism after baptism and hear life change story after life change story, it's hard to be against church growth. And I think that's ultimately why church growth matters to everybody, because at the end of the day, church growth is just lives being changed and transformed by the power of Jesus. And that's something that it is hard to be against. So 5 hard truths about healthy church growth. And the first 2 he starts out with. Number 1, he says, healthy churches grow, but not all growing churches are healthy churches. And number 2, healthy small churches usually don't stay small forever. So just because a church is growing doesn't mean it's healthy. And if your church is small, but it's healthy, it's probably not going to stay super small forever. So right out of the gate, it's clear we're not just talking about healthy church growth, we're also talking about healthy churches. So my question for you guys is, how would you define a healthy church versus an unhealthy church?
You know, I thought about that question, and I think there's so many different ways we could answer that. And if you ask me this question in a couple of weeks, I probably would have a different answer to give to you, because there's so many different factors that come in. But as I think about our church family here at University and where we are in the time that I've been here, I think I would define it as a healthy church is a community of Christ followers that have a shared vision, that have a thriving ministry and a trusted leadership. And what I like about those 3 factors are that they are qualitative rather than quantitative. In other words, the focus is more on the quality rather than the quantity. And I think a lot of times when we think of health of the church, we are so drawn to the numbers. And we think if we have large crowds, if we have good attendance at different assemblies or events, then that must mean health or healthy church. But I don't think that's always the case. I think quality is essential in that, which then brings us to the unhealthy church. And for me, an unhealthy church is a disconnected community. I think disconnected relationally, first with God, and that's always going to impact the relationship that we share with each other. I think also disconnected organizationally, where we're not strategically looking at a vision and a mission. We don't approach the ministry opportunities in the way that is most effective or allowing us to accomplish what God wants us to accomplish. And so churches that struggle with disconnection in their congregation, I think, are going to be unhealthy and probably are going to see the consequences of that.
So he says that healthy churches grow, but just because a church is growing doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy. But the thing he doesn't address, can you think of a situation in which a healthy church wouldn't grow?
There are several situations I could think of where healthy churches wouldn't grow, but the number one thing that comes to my mind, and Dan touched on it a little bit, is a lack of structure. And so if your church is healthy and you're growing and you're reaching people and more people you're bringing in, you have to rapidly adjust to that number of people that are going to be coming through your doors or entering into your church family. And I think if you don't have a great structure in place, then you're going to stop and have walls that you hit that we'll talk about a little bit later on when it comes to just how the church operates and how the church functions. So if you have everybody going to, in some cases, one person being a pulpit minister or a preacher, then you have a lot of weight on his shoulders and he just can't function all alone. And in our case, we have a group of men that you can go to, but even with that, we're still limited by what all they can handle, what all they have going on. And so I think structure is a really important key into focusing on how healthy churches can continue to grow in. And that shows us where they have a decline in a wall that they can hit with their membership. And so we have to focus on, really, we want to be healthy, but we also have the right structure in place in order to grow more.
So a healthy church just to summarize, is one that is united around shared goals and shared purpose, and one that is sufficiently organized and structured so that it can actually accomplish those goals and that vision. So it's not just something you put on a wall and forget about. So the third point that the article makes, and I think this is my favorite one, it says, an outward-focused church ultimately creates the healthiest insiders. So why do y'all think that outwardly focused churches tend to be healthier than self-focused congregations?
I mean, I think the simple answer to that is because Jesus was outward focused. And Jesus always put others before himself. In fact, his entire ministry was about elevating others by lowering himself and allowing himself even to suffer the cruel death on the cross. And you look at the New Testament writings and how often, we as God's people are called of this emptying of ourselves, the surrendering of ourselves, and living this life of service, of looking how do we submit, how do we help meet the needs of others. And, talking about the concept of what would cause a church not to grow, a healthy church. And I think, Jeremy, you were right about the structure and the lack of structure. I think sometimes we think that if we're busy, then that must mean that we're doing what's right, and that's good. But the goal of ministry has never been busyness. It's always been about taking the kingdom concepts and living them out in our lives and taking it into the community and hoping that we can help transform lives. And Jesus modeled that for us. I was thinking about his teaching in Matthew chapter 7, the golden rule, that you do to others as you would have them do to you. And I don't know about you guys, but for the longest time, I would always think about that golden rule, and I would sit back and think, well, how do I want others to treat me? And I, in my mind, I was inward focused. I was thinking, how do I want to be treated? And I think the essential part of that command are those first three words: do to others.
Yeah.
And I think that's what
That's
Jesus emphasized in his teaching and his ministry was the call of my followers is to go out and to be outward focused and do to others. And so I think that for any healthy church, we have to embrace that outward focus because that's what Jesus did. And if we're going to be healthy, then we're going to be as Christ-like as we can be.
Yeah, he says, and this is a quote from the article, an inherent part of the Christian faith is death to self. I mean, Jesus calls us to imitate him, to take up our crosses, to die to ourselves in order that something new might rise. And I think that pattern that we see in Jesus' life that we're supposed to emulate in our individual lives is also what we're called to do in our corporate life as a church. And he makes the point that if I'm self-focused at church, like if I think the purpose of church is to make me happy, and if everybody comes and thinks that the primary reason we're here is to be happy and to enjoy ourselves, why would we ever sacrifice for other people? Why would we ever embody that Christ-like spirit of putting others before myself if my main purpose is just to be happy and to have a good time, to be self-focused? So I think ultimately, if we as a church are outward focused, that's going to fight against those more self-focused tendencies that we sometimes see.
And I think we'll also find that the more outward focused we are, the greater amount of joy. We'll see the blessings of what it means to be a follower of Christ will be experienced, I think, in greatest measure when we are serving others. So.
I think oftentimes in churches we get that confused of having either an outward focus, focusing on them, or focusing on ourselves. And we think the two are, you have to do one or the other, and you can't do both well. But focusing on outwardly is also a way that we focus inwardly as we go through it. And I think we miss that a lot of times as church leaders.
I like that.
Yeah, it's not a zero sum where more outreach automatically correlates to like less inreach and less community. But I mean, both fuel one another. Like our community should fuel outreach, and our outreach should draw us together as a community. I mean, the more of both, the better both are going to be, I think.
Yeah.
So the next point he makes and I think we've hit on this a little bit already, but we'll talk more about it, is that even in healthy churches, right? Healthy churches tend to grow, but even in healthy churches, decline can happen sometimes for a season. It's not always going to be up and to the right, but in fact, you can have those seasons of scaling back, of declining a little bit. So why might a church that's healthy still enter a season of numerical decline?
There's a number of reasons we enter into seasons of numerical decline. First of all, we have to realize what a season is. And if the season of decline never ends, then, well, it's no longer a season, and things need to change and take place. But there's different reasons that we can enter into a season of decline. Largely it can be like what I talked about earlier, whenever you hit a growth barrier that you can't seem to pass. 200 is one of those growth barriers, and that's kind of where we hover around for the last 2 or 3 years that I've been here. And it's hard to break past that, because things have to change within the body, things have to change within the leadership, and that structure that we talked about earlier. But also, changing in leadership can be one of those things that prohibits growth. And so whenever even a youth minister is gone, college minister, pulpit minister, during that search process, things seem to kind of plateau, or maybe even some people will decide to go somewhere else during that time. But even a change of leadership and things like that, those can things be taken away and not make us as healthy as we used to be, and it can be a season of decline. So there's a lot of different things that go into what makes us into decline. It's not necessarily that it's just that you're unhealthy, but it could be a whole number of leadership responsibilities or church growth and numbers and things like that.
Mm-hmm. It could depend on your community. If your town is small or shrinking, I think you hit on this, if leadership is changing or you're having sort of a changing of the guard, sometimes people may choose to move on after that. It can be for any reason. But like you said, churches that stay healthy, that are unified, tend to always get back to seasons of growth.
And I love what he says in this article, that seasons have a beginning and an ending.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always important to remember, that even if you find yourself in a season of decline, if you are healthy, that there will come a time when that ends and you're going to turn the corner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe we probably have experienced that somewhat here, maybe at university. And maybe we've seen a little bit of a turning of a corner. Maybe we can see potential and an opportunity to start moving forward and seeing some growth. So it's important for us to kind of keep that perspective, especially if you find yourself in a season of decline or of uncertainty, and you're just beginning to wonder what's going on, what's happening, that there will come an end to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last point is that healthy leaders produce healthy churches. And I'll just summarize this real quick. I think it's pretty intuitive. If your leadership, so your elders, your staff, your other ministry leaders, if they're in conflict, if they are dealing with some sort of sin, if there's a toxic personality going on, or if there's just a lack of communication, anything like that would indicate poor either emotional or organizational health among the leadership, then that's going to reverberate out and ripple out into the church. So a healthy leadership is so important for churches, because that's going to set the tone and the direction for the entire church. So let's bring these 5 points home and see how we can connect them to just the average person who's sitting in a chair on a Sunday morning. So just let me recap real quick for those that are watching, and then we can sort of talk about the implications. The 5 points are that healthy churches grow. Healthy small churches usually don't stay small forever. An outward-focused church ultimately creates the healthiest insiders. Decline can happen for a season, even in healthy churches. And the last one, healthy leaders produce healthy churches. So for you guys, what implications do y'all think these 5 points have for the average church member?
I think the first thing that would cause any family member to maybe come to realize is that I have a part to play in the health of this church family. And if I was going to summarize it with one word, I would say it's being relational. Being relational with not only my family members and church family that I'm a part of, but being relational within the community. Jesus, I think he uses the analogy of, be the salt of the earth, be the light of the world. And I think that those two items are meant to be relational. I think they're meant to impact people's lives. But I think if we were to look at ourselves, if you were to look at your own life and think, maybe I am unhealthy. I think he brings this up in the article, what you need to do is look in the mirror to find the cause of that, because there's something within us that has maybe brought about this unhealthy behavior or just an outlook of that is seen to be unhealthy. And it's hard for us to do that. It's hard for us to be honest with where we are in our walk with Christ, and maybe to acknowledge that we have shortcomings, that we have things that we need to improve as God's people. But I like one of the things that he says in that article, which is that we reproduce who we are, not who we want to be. And so we have to take a real look at ourselves, and we have goals of how we want to improve and how to better ourselves, but we have to take an honest look at where are we right now, because that's what we're producing. That's what we're going to be portraying into the lives of the people that we contact. And if that needs to change, then we need to have the courage and the faith to address that and to make those changes.
Yeah, I think you hit on it well there in the end. It's the one word churches really don't like to hear, specifically churches of Christ, that we have to have change in our membership. We have to have change in our rows and everything else going on there. We have to be able to view church differently. Maybe this is not a place where we come and we see leaders leading on stage and we just get to sit back and enjoy the show, but we take part in that mission and we take part in that unity. When we look at our mission and vision, like how as a member am I able to embrace this and fulfill this as we go for a church? And that's going to take a lot of people the way they view church differently. It's going to have to change the way that we comprehend everything that goes on here.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for watching, and if you've been able to watch all 4 of our videos, thanks for sticking with us through it. Pray that God blesses you this week and that He fills your life with joy and peace in Christ. Thanks, everyone.